last time we talked, I went through this flowchart of the generalized flowchart of the Rome process on the right that goes from identifying objectives and restoration options through data collection, modeling, cost benefit analysis, and then showing kind of how that fits alongside in a sort of a parallel process of ecosystem services assessment, which would be the steps on the left, starting with, again, objectives and problem statement as they relate to ecosystem services that you're trying to address in your Rome assessment and your forest and landscape restoration. And then we generally go through a process of data collection, model development, generating scenarios, assessing potential outcomes. Sometimes these maps of ecosystem services and scenarios are used in a kind of prioritization or optimization. And then the results are synthesized, ideally integrated with other results and recommendations from parallel work streams in the Rome assessment, and then incorporated into the assessment as much as possible. So in today's webinar, I'm really going to focus more than before on these particular steps of data modeling and doing the sort of the steps and the tools and the approaches to do the assessments, the data analysis itself. Now, I'm also going to focus a lot on the natural capital projects tools like Invest, because this is, the tools that we've developed, although there are a lot of other options that you can use for modeling and mapping ecosystem services. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the in development tools that we are working on for optimization, like the Root tool that we've been working on for the last couple of years, specifically for this question of prioritizing FLR for Rome assessments. It's gone through some iterations, and we're currently refactoring it and hope to have a new release of that to distribute to everyone by the end of this project. So you can find out more information about these on our websites, and our forum is a good place for user support. So the tools is really a good place to start in this whole process. Once you've identified stakeholders and gone through sort of the project preparation phase, but it's important to really consider the kind of tool that's needed for the questions that you want to answer. And then also that's going to be a bit of an iterative back and forth with the data that you have to drive models and whether or not you're able to validate them. And even if you can't do a full calibration, it's usually good to include some kind of assessment of the uncertainty in those models based on the data that you can find or expert opinion, at least to make sure that your model is performing in a reasonable way and producing results that make sense. So selecting the right tool or approach is really important, and Invest is one tool, but I just wanted to make clear that there actually are a lot of different tools that have been developed to map and measure ecosystem services, but that each of these is going to have a different type of inputs required, and generally were developed for different purposes as well. Invest is listed there in the middle, and this one is really based on spatial mapping and process or empirical models for relating physical characteristics and land management with ecosystem services potential provision. We have other tools like TESSA, which is really meant to be more of a site-based assessment tool. And it's the one at the bottom, developed by BirdLife International. And that tool is really helpful if you have a particular location, like a farm or a community, and you want to map what the ecosystem services are that are being provided there. And so that's obviously meant to fill a different niche, a different need than Invest. A tool like Costing Nature, which is the second line from the top, is another approach that gives you an economic value for different ecosystems, but it's based on a benefits transfer approach. So they have a huge database of different habitat and ecosystem types from around the world and associated studies that have provided some economic value for those. And so that tool is really meant to give you a rough estimate of the total value of particular kinds of ecosystems. And so each of these approaches is going to have its benefits and it's going to have its shortcomings. And it's really important when you're choosing which method you use that you know look into these and see which one is going to be the most useful and give you the right kind of credible information for your context. Getting back to the InVEST models, this is just to give you an idea of what we provide as part of our model suite. We have a series of models, what we call the terrestrial models, which means they're generally applied in upland areas, and they're meant to look at terrestrial and freshwater kinds of issues. So we have things like habitat quality and risk assessment, annual and seasonal water yield. We have nutrient retention for water quality, regulation, things like carbon storage, crop pollination, etc. We also have a series of marine and coastal models, things like coastal vulnerability. So this is a model that looks at a shoreline and relates the areas where you have different kinds of habitat and ecosystems and how those are protecting the shoreline from sea level rise or storm surge or wave action, things like that. There's a couple of these models that are listed as marine, but actually can be applied in terrestrial or upland areas, like the recreation model can actually be applied anywhere. It relates visitation rates with features on the landscape, either natural features or man-made features like trails or roads or access. And then there's other things like scenic quality is another one that can be applied in a terrestrial sense as well. So each of these models is going to run as a standalone tool. They're all installed as part of the InVEST package, but at the beginning of the project, you decide which one of these ecosystem services you want to run, and then each model has its own data requirements, its own process for running the model, and then generally produces spatial and some non-spatial outputs that you can then overlay results from the different models. Most of these models will take in spatial data as well as some non-spatial data. Every one of the InVEST models is really based on either a land cover or a habitat location map. So the spatial location of land cover and land management is a really important driving force in the models, and climate is another important one, along with other physical characteristics. Typically, there's also table inputs that have parameters relating to each land cover or land management or each type of risk in the case of habitat risk assessment. And then in terms of outputs, they also are spatial models by design. So the outputs tend to be spatial. We have either something like in the coastal vulnerability model where it actually shows you just a 1 kilometer along the shoreline. So it doesn't go completely inland, but it's spatial in the sense that it will cover the entire shoreline in your area of interest. You can have other models like the pollination model gives you an output raster map of pollinator abundance and pollinator dependent crops across the landscape. And then other models like the water yield and the sediment retention models also output things summarized by watersheds or other spatial units. And then often there's also a table of summarized values from the models. So those are the kinds of outputs that InVEST generally produces, which can be different from some of the other models that I showed in that list. So if these are the kinds of results you need, and then InVEST could be a good choice. Do you need a GIS program to run InVEST? No, we have built our own library of GIS processing functions that InVEST is based on. So it's not required that you have GIS to run InVEST, but you do need some GIS program to process the inputs and the outputs and visualize the outputs and create maps. We often use QGIS, which is free, open source. It is the best open source GIS program available and has all of the same functions or most of the same functions as ArcGIS. ArcGIS is a little more user friendly. It has the user interface, but it is expensive to get a license unless you happen to be part of a university or other organization that has put in that money. Additionally, we provide a lot of resources. We have a very active user community. Every model has its own user guide. We offer training courses, workshops. We have a couple of online courses, which you can take for free through Stanford Online. We have the user community at forums.naturalcapitalproject.org, where people can go and ask questions, to troubleshoot models, to ask about parameter values, and that's a really good resource. And we also have a newsletter you can sign up for. Lots of resources on our website. So getting back to our process, we've talked a little bit about models and model selection. Once you've decided how you want to generate these estimates of ecosystem services, then you always start with a baseline, which would be this scenario on the left. This is from Uganda, and this is like your baseline scenario where you have a certain land use and management. And then you run the models. In this case, if we're running invest models, you would end up with a map for each service of what the level of that service is on the current landscape. And sometimes that is the limit at what you can do for your particular project, and that information can be really valuable to look at, where ecosystems currently providing a lot of services that maybe need to be protected versus where are ecosystems not providing a lot of services that maybe would be areas to focus on restoring or improving those services. Now, in other cases, you have the data and the capacity, and you want to actually look at scenarios. And so this would be, what is the change in that landscape? So you create additional land cover, land management maps like the one on the right that show you possible scenarios that you can compare with your baseline. And there's actually different kinds of scenarios you can think about using. Of course, the first kind is, before we even get to implementing activities, we can think about risk. So how are the current ES, how are they likely to change under different plausible futures? You could look at climate change, population growth, development, to again help identify areas that maybe are more at risk, that might be more in need of some interventions as a way to prioritize. You could also consider looking at scenarios of FLR interventions and how do these potential activities that you might do change ES provision. So you can look at scenarios of, say, reforestation or climate smart agriculture. These kinds of scenarios are what the team in Costa Rica was using to look at potential activities for Costa Rica. And an important point to remember here, though, is that in order to really adequately model these potential impacts, it does require some additional data on what the impacts of these activities might be on ecosystem state and functions, and also on people. So usually that would be in the form of like field studies where somebody has done agroforestry and they've measured the difference in soil loss from the baseline to the agroforestry. Ideally, that study would be somewhere in your area so you could trust that those results would be applicable. So once you have the baseline and the scenarios, you can use a model like Invest. You would run those scenarios through the model in order to give you this output of, for example, the change in sediment loss to streams. I showed this in the last webinar as well. I just want to reiterate the point that whether you're talking about the baseline ecosystem service or the scenario ecosystem service, it's also really important that you think about what the impacts might be to people. So we can start with, the change in sediment loss to streams or the amount of sediment being currently eroded on the landscape. But in order to really make this a story about ecosystem services, we have to show where people are that are going to benefit, that are either currently benefiting from these services or where they could benefit from improvements. So for the case of Uganda, for example, you would take that change in sediment loss to streams, you could look at the value of cropland. So people with more valuable cropland are going to benefit from less erosion on their lands. And also you could look at the population with access to safe drinking water. So people that are dependent on untreated water are going to benefit more from improvements in their water quality regulation, or conversely are more at risk from degradation of their water quality. And that kind of information is really critical to incorporate in these estimates of baseline ecosystem service or the change in ecosystem service. And so that gets into what we call mapping marginal values. So the term marginal value we use generally to refer to that change. So what is the marginal value of any given FLR intervention is the change in service that you expect to see from that intervention. And you want to summarize that change in metrics that are meaningful to the project's objectives and goals. One way to do that is just to do it in terms of biophysical metrics, like the first example I showed, the change in sediment or the change in nutrient or the change in water flow, either annually or seasonally. You could also think about translating that into economic metrics. So that would be the contribution of different areas or different activities to avoided water treatment costs or additional hydropower revenue or additional tourism revenue. So this is going to require some additional data on sort of the economic production function. How do you link the cost of avoided cost of water treatment or the increased revenue to link these to changes in the physical system? But marginal values can be expressed, in those metrics as well. And they can also be expressed in social metrics that don't have a monetary value, such as you could take those results from the change in sediment and the people dependent on untreated water to produce a map with the metric could be the number of people benefiting from cleaner water, or you could have the percent of poor farmers with improved yields, or people employed in FLR projects. So thinking about social metrics as a way to express these marginal values is another way to really connect the project results to the concept of ecosystem services and then also to the goals of the ROAM assessment. So once we have the marginal values calculated, then often this information is used to prioritize which FLR interventions you do and where you're going to do them. And again, there's a couple of different methods, a few different methods you can use to do that, depending on your data, depending on your model outputs, depending on your capacity. One relatively straightforward way to do this is to just use GIS overlays. You could look at the baseline ecosystem services provision and biophysical metrics and social metrics, the number of people dependent on those, and just look at where is ES currently low that we need to improve it, or where is ES currently high and we want to make sure and protect those areas, or maybe they're currently at risk. A second way to do this that I believe is often done in these ROAM assessments is to do a kind of multi-criteria analysis. So you take either the baseline ES or some scenario results and integrate this information with other project goals, other kinds of data that are important to decision makers there in order to identify the most critical places to work. And then finally, sort of the most complex way to go about this that we've been exploring a lot, especially with the folks in Costa Rica, is this multi-benefit optimization, which is a way to evaluate trade-offs between two different ES and their benefits and costs, or trade-off between the amount of benefit you get versus what it's going to cost you. And so this is where the tools like Root that we've been working on come in. And actually, I'm going to give you an example of one of what we call the frontiers, the outputs of this kind of optimization. It lets you look at sort of the big picture of what these different landscapes could look like and how they results relate to different objectives. So again, this is an example from Uganda. On the x-axis, we have the total carbon storage, and then which is percent of maximum possible. And then on the y-axis, we have the species richness. Each point along this curve is a particular landscape. And you have examples shown here of 4 different landscapes. So this landscape on the top left represents areas that if we were to restore, that we would restore, 99 or more percent of the possible species richness. So this is sort of totally focusing on species richness. We get some benefit in carbon storage, but not as much. The point all the way on the bottom and the right is a landscape where your interventions are prioritized entirely based on where we can store the most carbon. So we get, in this case, a 90% increase in carbon storage, but a very small improvement in this total species richness. And the interesting thing about these trade-off frontiers that you can do is you can begin to understand where you can find sort of easy wins or obvious wins versus places where the trade-offs are more stark. So for example, this landscape here that provides a lot of carbon storage, but very little improvement in species richness. If you were to say, choose this point that's 2 or 3 points up, you really don't lose very much carbon at all, but you gain a huge gain in the species richness. And so this is an area where starting to look at both of those objectives means that you can have a huge win in one area with a very low trade-off in the other, versus the area sort of in the middle of the curve where the trade-offs are more obvious, where you to choose between, the points in the middle, you have to give up a lot of one or the other. And then it becomes really a political decision and a question of values and a negotiation among the stakeholders. But having this information helps make those trade-offs clear so the conversation can be transparent. So one tool that we've been working on to show this is the root tool, as I mentioned. And this was meant to be to take in information of marginal values, like from InVEST models, and then to generate these benefit curves so you can visualize what those trade-offs might look like, and also allows you to put in certain constraints and then generate those optimal frontiers based on that. So either a constraint in terms of the total amount of area target that we have for doing FLR, or the total budget that we have to spend for different activities. And I actually have an example here from Costa Rica. So Leander, you're very familiar with this example because you helped develop it. And I understand that this is, this is not final results. We've been iterating on this a lot, but this is one of the recent runs that we've done. I want to show you just to illustrate how this really looks in practice. So in this example, we're looking at one particular activity, which is banana restoration, and with two different objectives, either maximizing nitrogen retention or maximizing phosphorus retention. So we want to improve, we want to see the most improvement in either, seeing less phosphorus pollution in the water or less nitrogen pollution in the water. And we have a constraint. We have 70,000 total hectares of bananas in the country. And we, first of all, modeled the marginal value of restoration, which is the scenario assessment using InVEST, looking at what is the change in nitrogen and phosphorus if this banana restoration is implemented everywhere possible. And we wanted to know what are the areas that provide the most significant reduction, and how do the areas that we target differ if we have different priorities. So just to go quickly through a couple of the results for this. So the map that you see here is the country of Costa Rica, and the blue areas show the marginal value, the reduction per hectare in nitrogen. So the darker blue areas are places where banana restoration reduces more nitrogen, and the lighter areas are places it reduces less nitrogen. And then the sort of medium gray all around is the rest of the country where there's no bananas at all. So that's not available for any activities. So that's nitrogen. And then you can see that if you look at phosphorus, the same map, but this is the change in phosphorus from banana restoration. the dark areas, the priority areas, change a little bit. There's some that overlap and some that are different. So just toggling between those two, you begin to see sort of that there is a trade-off between whether you're focusing on nitrogen or phosphorus reduction in this project. So the next step was, say, given that information, what if we say we can't restore all of the bananas, we actually can only do 10,000 hectares. So which areas should we choose? We use this optimization approach to identify the places where we can achieve the largest nutrient benefit for the given area, and looked at, both nitrogen and phosphorus and how that differs. So this is the constrained scenario. If we only look at nitrogen, the areas in dark green are the areas that the 10,000 hectares that are highest priority. Whereas if we look at phosphorus, then this is the 10,000 hectares of highest priority. Using this kind of information, then given that we have 10,000 hectares to restore, we generated a lot of scenarios. Each one of these points is one of those scenario maps, and it shows you the shape of this curve, the trade-off between reducing nitrogen and reducing phosphorus if you only have 10,000 hectares to work on. So again, the point on the bottom right is the reduction in nitrogen loading, the maximum amount we could get with 10,000 hectares and not really caring anything about phosphorus. And the point on the top left is only caring about phosphorus and not really caring about nitrogen. And again, you can see from this point on the right, there's several options here on the right where you can get pretty big gains in phosphorus by changing your priorities a little bit without losing a lot of that reduction in nitrogen. And then vice versa up here on the top left. So really, we'd probably want to pick some point along the frontier on the right where we balance both nitrogen and phosphorus loading. And this is a point where I think also the benefits to people could be really helpful in making this decision. Like, where are the people that are dependent on this water, especially, if it's untreated water? Where are people more at risk from nitrogen pollution versus phosphorus pollution? Is there a difference in the risk that these different things pose to people's water supply? Is one more costly to treat for than the other? And those sorts of things then begin to help make that decision, which is why it's so important to bring those data in. Just one more way to visualize this kind of information here I wanted to show is this. This is just a count map of the number of times each one of these areas is chosen for this restoration. So again, we have 10,000 hectares, so we have a limited amount of area to work. No matter what our objectives are, the places in the darkest blue are always chosen, or were chosen the most times, as the places to restore. And the places in the lightest gray were never chosen. No matter what your objectives are, you're not going to get any phosphorus benefit or nitrogen benefit from restoring these banana plantations that are light gray. Again, this darker gray is just the rest of the country where there are no bananas. So this is another way to see, to think about, where these priority areas are. Like, it doesn't really matter what you care about. You're going to get benefits from both of these things. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you care about nitrogen or phosphorus, to be clear. You get benefits for both of those when you pick these dark blue points. It's another way to think about prioritizing where to work. So one last thing I wanted to show you is a way related to this. Is I don't have these results for Costa Rica, but my colleague Peter Hawthorne has developed this cool web app that it takes the kind of results that we're just showing you and visualizes it in an interactive way that is very cool for sharing in a stakeholder dialogue. Because it's a similar example. This is in the United States from Wolf Creek, which is somewhere in the Midwest United States, and it's a website, so you can go to this link and actually lets you click around on each one of these points. You can see what the landscape looks like. In this case, we're looking at cost versus reduction in nitrogen. We can look at phosphorus, we can look at sediment. And also you can see that each one of these has a different different shape of the curve. So in some cases, for very little expenditure, you can get a pretty big improvement, from this point to that point, and then it really levels out as you go farther along. Whereas for others, it's maybe a little more flat. You have to spend more to get more reduction. So this one it's just an interesting tool. I understand it's relatively easy to load results from the invest models and the optimization into something like this, so you can use it as an interactive visualization when you're talking with people about what these trade-offs mean, and then what does that look like for this landscape. All right, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Very last thing I wanted to mention, this is also something we're working on right now for Costa Rica, and I keep hitting on it a lot, and that is how you can use beneficiaries in this process. We have for Costa Rica right now, we're looking at hydroelectric stations, which are the points in yellow. We have human drinking water, so these are points where drinking water, or concessions are made for extracting drinking water. Some of these are surface water, some are groundwater, and we're working on teasing those out. We also have biodiversity areas. So there's a few different ways you can think about including this information in the process, and not just for drinking water, but for any kind of beneficiaries information. One thing that's often done is we can look at the distribution of benefits. So who benefits from different kinds of restoration activities. You can look at it post hoc. You can go through this whole process of looking at the landscapes like we were just doing and decide, okay, this is the one we want. We want this much reduction in phosphorus. We want this much improvement in biodiversity. And then once you decide on those priorities, you can overlay information about beneficiaries, about people, to determine who is going to end up benefiting from those interventions. And that can be an iterative process. And what does that mean for people? So that's sort of a post hoc way of doing it. Another way to do it, say earlier in the process, if you're doing some kind of prioritization or optimization, you can actually define the benefits in the objective function, which you can do that by, rather than just having maps of marginal change in phosphorus or marginal change in nitrogen, you can actually have marginal change in the benefit to people. You could have the change in farming revenue, the change in the number of poor people with cleaner water by district, for example. And that could be used as the metric that you optimize on. So that's a way of including people sort of farther back in the process and more specifically in the analysis before you get to the end. One other possible way to do it is to treat the distribution of benefits as a constraint, again in your optimization, but in this case you would define that all of your quote optimal scenarios have to meet certain targets for benefiting particular people in particular locations. And both of those relate to kind of the prioritization optimization process. But the idea is that you take that information in before you make the final decision about where to work, instead of the first option where you decide where to work based on physical changes, and then you see how that benefits people. All right, so that was the end of the webinar for today. I'd really love to hear your thoughts and reactions on any of that information and what is more or less useful to you in your projects, or if you have any general questions. And you can also follow up with me later by email. Thanks so much for joining and listening.